In the spring of 1816, the dirt of Dawson County was softer than usual. Winter had broken early that year, leaving the ground wet and forgiving, easy to dig. The Rowe family burial was scheduled for a Tuesday. 5 caskets stood in a crooked line beside the churchyard, each smaller than the last. No headstones yet, just fresh pine boxes hammered and sealed, marked with chalk initials that had already begun to blur from morning dew. The townspeople arrived in silence. The Rowes were not well loved, but they were respected. Quiet folk, kept to themselves. Ruth Rowe, the mother, stood at the head of the line, her hands folded at her waist, eyes dry, face drawn tight like someone trying not to laugh in church. She wore mourning black, but her gloves were clean, her shoes polished, and when Pastor Allgood read the names aloud, she didn't flinch. Just stared straight ahead, unmoving, as if listening for something deeper than words. Each coffin belonged to a child. The oldest was 11, the youngest had just turned 4. Ruth had told the church they'd all succumbed to a rare southern fever that took them one by one in the span of a week. No doctor had seen them, no death certificates filed, but no one questioned it. Grief had a way of muting suspicion, and Ruth Rowe had always carried herself like a woman who knew more than others ever would. But things felt off. The air around the gravesite felt colder than the season allowed. The pastor's voice trembled when he reached the 4th coffin. Some swore they heard something hollow ring out from the inside when the box was lowered. A sound not of shifting flesh, but of something solid hitting wood. After the final coffin was covered, Ruth requested a moment alone. The mourners stepped back. Those who lingered at the tree line claimed they saw her kneel, not in sorrow, but in something closer to reverence. One woman, Mrs. Tibbs, said she saw Ruth place her bare hand on each mound of soil in turn, then murmur the same phrase after each one. Something like, "Well done," or "Now stay." No one asked. No one wanted to. It wasn't until the following week that anything official was stirred. An undertaker's apprentice, newly arrived from Savannah, had helped unload the coffins before the service. He didn't speak much English, but he understood weight, and something about those boxes had unsettled him. He told the sheriff in broken phrases, too light, too quiet, no smell. The sheriff shrugged it off. Fevered bodies, he said, could be dry and small, shriveled even. But the boy returned again. This time he brought with him a splinter of linen he'd kept, pulled from the lip of the 4th coffin before the funeral. It was clean. Too clean. Starched, white, tightly wound. The sheriff, reluctant but cornered, agreed to investigate, quietly. 2 nights later, under cover of dark, they exhumed one of the graves. The 1st coffin creaked open like a jaw long locked shut. Inside was not a child. It was a stone roughly the size of a torso, wrapped tightly in linen and twine, smooth river rock, the kind pulled from creek beds. Clean. No blood, no trace of decay. They opened the others all the same. 5 boxes, 5 stones, all wrapped like infants, all nestled in straw as if awaiting something sacred, and not one body. The sheriff went pale. The pastor vomited into his hat. The apprentice knelt and whispered a prayer in a language no one understood. The graveyard was sealed off. Ruth Rowe was summoned. She arrived calmly, even smiled at the officers waiting on her porch. She wore the same gloves from the funeral, same polished shoes. When told what was found, she said only, "Not everyone leaves a body behind." Then she asked if she could go back inside and finish her tea. She was not arrested. There were no laws about burying stones, no way to prove what or who had ever been inside those coffins. But the town knew. Something terrible had happened beneath that roof. Something colder than fever, quieter than death. And still the house stood, the rooms untouched, the children's shoes still lined neatly by the back door. By the end of the month, most neighbors refused to speak Ruth's name. Children crossed the street when passing her property, and the pastor stopped his sermons altogether, declaring that some grief rots a soul too far to bless. But Ruth never left. She tended her garden, she hung her laundry, and every Sunday she stood at the back of the church alone, watching. Never sitting, never crying, just watching, waiting. The ground had taken no children that week, but it had taken something else. And what remained above it, breathing, walking, smiling, was beginning to feel like a punishment still in progress. The sheriff burned his uniform and quit. The apprentice disappeared. The graveyard grew wild, thistle covering each mound. But no one dared plant headstones, not after what they'd seen, not with the salt still seeping up from the earth, not with the feeling that something had been exchanged, not buried. And as summer crept in, and the heat thickened the air, the scent that should have come, of rot, of death, never arrived. Just silence. The kind that listens, the kind that remembers, the kind that waits. After the coffins were buried, after the townspeople scattered back to their lives, Dawson County began to whisper in smaller, colder tones. The Rowe name didn't vanish, it calcified. The Rowe land sat at the edge of the woods where the path bent sharp and the trees grew too close to the road. People had always said the house sat wrong on the land, turned slightly off axis from the sun. But it wasn't the crooked shadows that unsettled them now. It was her, Ruth, the woman who should have broken down, who should have screamed at the earth as it swallowed 5 of her own. But she hadn't. She hadn't even trembled. No one remembered her wiping her eyes, not once during the long walk from the wagon to the graves, not during the pastor's reading of their names, not when the final shovel of dirt fell and silence pressed down like a lid. Ruth stood straight, shoulders still, hands clasped like she was waiting for an audience to quiet. A few women tried to offer comfort. One reached to take her hand and said softly, "If you ever need anything." But Ruth just looked at her and said with a faint smile, "We'll do better next time." That phrase did something to people. Next time. As if there were more to come, as if the children were a trial run, as if motherhood to her was a task to refine. And now they wondered if the children had ever died at all. Or worse, if they had, whether it had been planned. Intentional. Ruth had always been precise, her home spotless, her speech slow and careful, her clothes always pressed. But now every detail of her presence took on new weight. How she arranged stones around her garden, not for beauty but in geometric patterns. How she asked the pastor once if there were biblical punishments for souls born unsorted. How she had once, long ago, refused a wet nurse for her youngest, insisting that certain nourishment changes the nature of will. These things had seemed eccentric before. Now they felt calculated, like pieces of a process only she could name. At the general store, the town women speculated with trembling voices. Maybe the children had been ill in some way no one could see, or maybe they were never quite children at all. There were stories told low and often half dismissed of strange sounds at night from the Rowe property. Rhythmic thuds like someone walking in circles above the barn. Flickers of light in the woods behind the house. Not lanterns, but pale and shivering like fireflies caught in a jar of water. One man swore he saw the children outside once, just standing in a row behind the barn, all 5 of them barefoot facing the same direction, unmoving for hours. Another claimed to have been invited in for supper once and found the dining room table entirely empty, except for one large mirror laid flat at the center, reflecting nothing. But it was Ruth's behavior after the burial that truly began to unravel what little comfort the town had left. She didn't retreat. She didn't mourn. She kept attending Sunday service, arriving alone, sitting in the back. She brought pies to the market. She asked the blacksmith if he could sharpen bone. When he asked what kind, she smiled and said, "The kind that remembers what it carried." Children began waking from nightmares they couldn't explain. Dogs barked at the road facing the Rowe house, and no one could bring themselves to say the children's names aloud, as if doing so would call something back that hadn't left cleanly. When the sheriff asked Ruth once in passing if she was managing all right, she tilted her head and answered softly, "Grief only blooms when you've lost something. I haven't." And then she walked on, leaving the man too stunned to reply. That was the first time he truly feared her. Not for what she had done, but for what she believed she hadn't. The town began to rot at its edges, not physically, but spiritually. Trust unraveled, laughter dulled. The church pews felt colder, because in the place where sorrow should have spilled out like floodwater, Ruth Rowe had left only silence. That kind of emptiness doesn't heal, it seeps, it infects, it waits. Dr. Ezra Bell had been Dawson County's only physician for nearly 2 decades, a quiet man with a trembling hand and soft voice. He kept his home office meticulous, right down to the faded curtain that never shifted no matter the wind. He died in the summer of 1816, not long after the Rowe burials. His passing was sudden. Stroke, they said. Found slumped at his desk, still holding a quill in his hand, the ink blotting into the corner of his ledger like a spreading bruise. His death might have passed without remark, just another frail body laid to rest, if not for the strange request in his will, that his personal medical ledgers be delivered not to the town's new doctor nor to any relative, but to the church. For the record of truth, it read. No one knew what he meant, but Pastor Allgood, still shaken from the funeral weeks earlier, honored the wish. The ledger was old, thick, the pages brittle with sweat and time. It smelled of camphor and smoke. Most entries were as expected, routine illnesses, births, minor injuries, until one reached the last section. Tucked between blank pages and pinned with a rusted clasp, a folded sheet bore a list of 5 names: Elias, Miriam, Tobias, Jonah, Liddy, the Rowe children. Their names were neatly written, each followed by a date scrawled in a different ink. Not dates of birth, not dates of death. Each one fell on a Thursday, spread evenly across 2 years. But what chilled the pastor were the lines beneath each name. Under diagnosis, there was nothing. No symptoms, no notes, just space. Blank. As if Dr. Bell had written the names down, then paused, unable or unwilling to record what he had seen. There were other signs. A margin note beside Jonah's entry read simply, "Refused light." Another by Miriam said, "Awake for 70 hours. No signs of strain." One line under Elias's, "Dislocated jaw, no pain, no memory." These weren't the ailments of ordinary children. These were warnings, clues, or perhaps confessions. But nowhere did Bell assign blame. Nowhere did he record cause. It was as if the sickness itself had no origin, only presence. The kind that settled slowly without fever or rash, but with something colder, something quieter, something that changed a child from the inside out. Later pages were even stranger. There were diagrams, rough sketches of joints, tendons, mouth shapes, and eyes. One page showed a child's arm bent backward at the elbow with impossible symmetry, and a note, "Voluntary, smiling." Another had a chart with columns labeled obedience, resistance, retention. The rows bore symbols instead of names. Some resembled tally marks, others runes. At the very bottom on the last line of the book, in handwriting less careful than the rest, were 3 words. Not all human. The pastor closed the book and locked it in the rectory chest that night. He told no one, But over time, the townspeople noticed he no longer spoke of healing or prayer. His sermons shortened. His eyes stayed fixed on the back pew, the one Ruth Rowe still sat in, always alone. As for the ledger, it remained sealed for decades until a renovation in 1894 uncovered it again. By then, the ink had faded, but the names were still legible, and the dates, and the silence where the diagnoses should have been, still louder than anything written in ink. The letter was folded into fourths, tucked into the spine of an old devotional, and found long after the traitor who'd written it was buried nameless in another town's soil. Dated October of 1815, months before the funerals, it was addressed to a sister in North Carolina and postmarked from Dawson County. The handwriting was tight, slanted, the kind of script that seemed to flinch with every line. The trader, Martin Bellamy, a peddler of textiles and pins, had passed through the region during harvest season. Rain had slowed his mule cart, and the Rowe family had offered him a night's shelter. He had accepted, noting the house looked proper, if somber. He'd heard whispers of the woman who lived there, but saw nothing strange, at first. The letter began warmly enough. He described the neatness of the porch, the folded towels in the washroom, the smell of pine oil and starch that hung in the air like ritual. But by the second page, the tone shifted. It became clear that what Martin had experienced in that house had followed him long after he left. He wrote of the children first. 5 of them, he noted, all quiet, all oddly still. Not one made eye contact. They moved when spoken to, but only after a moment's delay, like their ears were tuned to some other instruction. He described how they sat for supper in complete silence, forks never scraping the plates, chewing measured, mechanical. When Martin complimented the youngest's manners, Ruth answered before the boy could lift his head. "Manners," she said, "are the shape of obedience." He wrote that her voice didn't carry. It arrived, soft but heavy somehow, weighted with something final. The punishment came after dinner. Martin had offered to help wash dishes, and while returning a dry cloth to the parlor, he saw something he wouldn't forget. The oldest child, Elias, was standing in the corner, arms at his sides, head tilted up toward a blank patch of wall. His eyes were open wide, not frightened, just hollow. Ruth stood behind him, speaking calmly. "No hands," she said, "no marks." But the lesson lands deeper when it sinks into the bone by silence. She turned slightly, and Martin stepped back into the shadows of the hallway. He said he watched Elias begin to tremble, barely, not from cold, but as if something unseen was pressing against him. He didn't cry. He didn't move. Ruth whispered something else, and the shaking stopped. Martin didn't sleep that night. Then came the mirrors. He noted that every reflective surface in the house, whether mirror, basin, or window pane, had been blackened. Not smashed, not removed, covered. Soot, ashes, even one painted over with what looked like tar. He asked Ruth the next morning casually if she'd covered the mirrors for mourning. She smiled and said, "It's not mourning. It's containment." When pressed, she added, "Reflection is a doorway if you let it be. Some children aren't meant to see their other side." He left shortly after, faking a headache, claiming his mule had taken sick. But the final line in Martin's letter was what the archivist who found it said chilled him the most. After recounting the supper, the punishments, the soot, he wrote, "No one in that house cast a shadow. Not the children, not me. Not even the flames in the stove, only her. And hers moved when she didn't." The letter was never sent. It remained hidden, maybe out of fear, or maybe because he knew no one would believe it. But in that single night beneath the Rowe roof, a stranger had seen more than most. And what he saw didn't scream. It didn't bleed. It didn't beg. It just stood still, stared back through a darkened mirror, and waited. They didn't find the room until early autumn, Months after the burials, when the Rowe farmhouse stood silent and still, its windows clouded with dust and curtains pulled tight against the sun. The house had been left untouched after Ruth vanished. No sale, no inheritance, no claim from kin. It just sat there, unowned but not forgotten. Some said they saw candlelight in the attic late at night. Others heard footsteps pacing the porch, though the doors were bolted shut. But it was the smell that finally drove men to act. Not rot, not mildew, but something sharp, mineral, and strangely sterile, like medicine left too long in the heat. Sheriff Dunley ordered the floorboards torn up in the kitchen. Beneath them, buried under a foot of compacted dirt, was a narrow iron ring fixed to a trap door. It took 4 men and a crowbar to pry it open. The air that spilled out wasn't stale, it was cold. Dry. A breathless kind of cold that didn't belong in Georgia soil. The room beneath was man-made, squared with precise angles, lined with white bricks that looked almost new. There was no mold, no insects, no decay. Just silence and salt. Salt packed tight along every wall, layered inches thick from floor to shoulder height. The corners were sharper than they should have been. Nothing in that room had softened with time. The light from their lanterns bounced off the brick in a way that made the walls seem to pulse. But it wasn't the salt that stopped them. It was the carvings. Each wall bore the outline of a human figure, 5 in total. Carved deep into the white brick, not stylized, life-sized, realistic. Arms straight, feet together, hands slightly splayed like children standing at attention. Each silhouette was slightly different. One had longer fingers, another's head was tilted, one was smaller, barely waist-high. But none had faces, and none had names. The outlines were cut into the brick cleanly, as though traced around the living, and beneath each, a hollow in the salt, just large enough to have once held a body. But those hollows were clean, bone-dry, no stains, no dust. Nothing. Only smooth indentations, as if whatever had once rested there had never decayed. Only vanished. The sheriff stepped inside first. He said the salt burned his boots. Not the way fire does, but with a strange friction, like walking across static. Another man tried to speak, but found his voice caught in his chest. No one stayed long. The room was sealed again, not for protection, but for denial. They reported nothing, told no one, but each man left with something dark seated in his chest, an understanding not of what had happened, but of how carefully it had been prepared. This was no panic, no accident. The salt wasn't for flavor or superstition, it was containment, control. It was part of something older, methodical, ritual perhaps, scientific maybe, but never accidental. Later, a carpenter who had helped uncover the chamber took to drinking alone on his porch, muttering about what salt was meant to preserve and what it was meant to keep out. Or in. He died 2 winters later. The last thing he said, according to his son, was this: "She carved them while they were breathing." The cellar was never reopened, and the house, though abandoned, was never torn down. Because the town feared what might still be buried, not in the earth but in the clean spaces where nothing dared to remain. It was only after Ruth vanished that the cousins came forward, 3 boys and 1 girl, all grown by then, scattered across counties, each with a different last name. Their stories emerged quietly, reluctantly, as if torn from some deep root they had worked for years to bury. They hadn't lived in the Rowe house full time, only visited in summers when their parents left them with Aunt Ruth for weeks at a time. Back then it was spoken of as a privilege. Ruth had no husband but was known to be strict, proper, and generous with chores that built character. That's what the adults believed. But the cousins remembered it differently. They remembered the cellar, not the one with salt and silhouettes, a different one. Deeper, accessible only through a narrow shaft hidden behind the pantry wall, concealed by a shelf that only Ruth was ever allowed to move. They remembered being taken down one by one, blindfolded, told they were ready. She called them obedience trials. Not punishment, not discipline, preparation. She said the body must first forget comfort and the mind must learn silence before the soul could be trusted. The rules were simple and absolute: 3 days in darkness, no sound, no movement, no matter what they heard. She said the soundless man watched the ones who twitched. If they cried, he marked them. If they spoke, he'd wait until their voices stopped for good. One cousin, Nathan, said he tried to hum on the second day, just to keep from panicking, and heard a breath beside him that wasn't his own. It stayed there for hours. Never moved. Just breathed. Another Clara said she felt hands brush her face in the dark but didn't scream because she didn't know if screaming would make it worse. They said the air grew thin by the second day. That time folded. That their ears began inventing things, but they knew the difference between imagination and warning. One swore she felt her own name whispered inside her skull, not aloud, inside. Another recalled something tapping steadily against the wall, not pacing, counting. A third said she passed out sometime near the end, and when she woke, the darkness wasn't empty anymore. She felt someone kneeling beside her. But when the door creaked open on the third day, nothing remained. Just her, and a thick line of salt spread across the threshold. No cousin was ever tested more than once. Ruth said one trial was enough to sort the weak from the worthy. They never spoke of it again. Not to their parents, not to each other. They buried it, let years of distance and doubt turn it into a shared bad dream. But after the coffins filled with stones were buried, and Ruth was gone, the memories returned like rot beneath clean wood. And when they saw the sketches found in Dr. Bell's ledger, the outlines, the notes on stillness and muscle control, they knew. They hadn't been trained, they'd been measured. What Ruth sought wasn't obedience, it was erasure, a quieting of the human self. Something stripped clean, silenced, made hollow enough to be inhabited. That's what one cousin said anyway, before recanting the interview and disappearing from public life. What stayed behind were fragments, descriptions, patterns, a truth too monstrous to hold all at once but impossible to forget once glimpsed. That Ruth Rowe believed in a version of perfection that began with silence and ended with something worse. Something that watched from the dark. Something that never breathed until you did. They said Silas was the quietest of the Rowe children, even before the cellar. A boy with dark lashes and a sunken chest, always watching, always listening. He never interrupted, never played too loudly, never laughed unless the others did first. But Ruth favored him, that much everyone agreed on. She praised his posture, his penmanship, the way he folded his hands while others fidgeted. She once told a neighbor that Silas had a body built for stillness, that he was emptier than the others, closer to useful. No one knew what she meant, and no one asked. When the obedience trials began in secret, Silas was the first to go. Not the oldest, not the strongest, just the one Ruth seemed to trust most. She led him down herself, hand on his shoulder, soft humming in her throat like a lullaby that had never belonged to a child. He didn't cry when the door shut. He didn't ask why the air already smelled like salt and burnt paper. He simply sat down in the corner the way Ruth had shown him, legs crossed, hands folded, eyes closed. For 3 days, no one opened the door. Ruth didn't leave the house. She moved quietly above, never pausing near the kitchen, never acknowledging the trap door beneath her feet. On the third morning, just before dawn, she unlocked it. Silas came up alone. He didn't blink at the light, didn't stumble, didn't speak. He looked at her, then straight ahead, as if something had permanently changed the way his eyes understood the world. When Ruth asked how he felt, he did not answer. When she smiled and whispered, "You didn't move, did you?" he only tilted his head, slow and bird-like. Then he walked past her, out the back door, and stood barefoot in the grass for nearly an hour. Neighbors would later recall seeing him there, arms loose, gaze fixed on the treetops. And when his name was called, he did not turn. From that day on, Silas never spoke again. And more than that, he never heard. Not voices, not thunder, not the snap of branches underfoot or the hiss of summer rain against the roof. He was not frightened by sudden noises, not startled by shouts or firecrackers. His ears, doctors later said, were physically intact. No signs of trauma, no explanation. But he was unreachable, as if the world had dimmed into still pictures. He did not return to school. He did not weep when the others vanished. He simply stayed quiet, moving like someone already underwater. Years passed. Ruth disappeared. The family buried stones. And Silas remained the only one who had gone in and come out whole, if silent. He was sent to live with distant relatives, none of whom spoke of his time in Dawson County. He learned to read lips. He sketched constantly, mostly blank faces with open mouths surrounded by black scribbles. Sometimes he drew outlines of rooms with no windows. Sometimes just a single eye, hovering above a child curled into the corner of a page. When he turned 19, an interviewer from a university research team came to ask about the cellar, about the trials, about Ruth. Silas listened carefully, watching the man's mouth. He nodded. He took the paper and pencil handed to him, and after nearly half an hour of stillness, he wrote a single sentence in careful block letters. The silence had a mouth. He pushed the page forward, stood, and walked away. He died in his sleep 8 years later. The cause was listed as unexplained neurological collapse, but those who remembered Silas knew differently. Whatever had visited him in that cellar hadn't left when the door opened. It had moved in slowly over years, filling the space where sound once lived. And by the time his heart stopped, there was nothing left but quiet. A quiet that watched. A quiet that remembered. The attic trunk had been there the whole time, latched, dust-caked, wedged beneath a splintered rafter as if the house itself had tried to forget it. When the Rowe property was finally searched in full decades later, during a routine historical inventory for the state archives, the inspectors nearly missed it. The house was collapsing in places by then. Its porch sagged like a tired mouth. Windows were black with mildew. Floorboards gave under weight, but the attic, sealed tight beneath a warped ceiling, held something dry, preserved, clean, in the way things often are when they've been untouched not by time but by intent. The trunk was cedar wrapped in canvas, stitched with a single word, order. Beneath the lid, folded neatly, lay a quilt, no dust on it, no mold, just rows and rows of small, perfect squares, each made from different fabrics, stitched with childlike precision. But the initials in the center of each square were not childlike. They were sharp, angular. Some had been carved into the cloth itself, others embroidered with thread so tight it looked burned into the fabric. 5 of the initials were familiar: E.R., M.R., T.R., J.R., and L.R. Elias, Miriam, Tobias, Jonah, Liddy, the children. Their names spelled in silence. And they were placed in a specific pattern, one that formed a cross with L.R. at the center. It wasn't until the quilt was moved under laboratory light that the unease began to grow. It smelled faintly of copper, even after all those years. The threads that bound the squares looked dull red in places, aged but too dark to be rust. A forensic technician ran a scan, then another. The fabric glowed under black light. Not all of it, just the threadwork. And in a pattern that no one had expected, branching filaments radiating from the initials outward, beneath the visible stitching like veins. Further testing revealed the impossible. The thread binding the quilt had been infused with preserved human plasma, its proteins still partially intact. Not enough to identify DNA, but enough to confirm the source. It was human. And it had been stabilized with a chemical compound no lab could identify, some primitive preservation method that predated medical knowledge of blood shelf life. The quilt, they said, had bled. Not metaphorically, literally. Whatever had been woven into it had once pumped through veins, but it wasn't just the blood. On the underside of the quilt, pressed tightly against the backing, someone had scrawled more letters, so faint they could only be seen under angled light. They formed no names, just phrases. Unformed must be bound. Silence keeps shape. Obedience seals the flesh. Each one repeated, each stitched backward like meant to be read from inside the fabric, from inside the bed. The quilt had been found in a trunk, but it hadn't been made for storage. It had been used. The creases matched a small child's bed frame. The cotton padding bore indentations where a body once lay, night after night. No one knows which child it belonged to. Perhaps all of them. Perhaps none. Some believed it was a tool, a focus for Ruth's strange methods. Others believed it was the binding object for something far older than her. A ritual not born from madness but inherited, carried, translated into fabric and flesh. After the discovery, the quilt was sealed in an archival containment chamber. Officials debated destroying it, but something in the room always shifted when the topic was raised. Lights dimmed, ink bled from pens, skin grew cold without wind. Eventually it was hidden in state custody. No photos released, no reports made public, but those who saw it said the same thing. It didn't look evil. It looked tender. As if the one who stitched it had loved what she was making, had loved what she was undoing. And that perhaps is what chilled the most. That cruelty can wear care like a second skin, and that something meant to comfort could bleed even after its maker was gone. The Rowe house stood longer than anyone expected it would. Years after Ruth vanished, years after the funerals of stone and silence, the house remained, its shutters hanging crooked, its chimney bowing toward the earth. Some said it stayed standing because no one dared knock it down. Others claimed the land beneath it had gone sour, that roots refused to grow there and compasses spun wild if held too close to the foundation. But in 1881, a growing township demanded the past be cleared for progress. The Rowe property was sold off, and a demolition crew was sent to flatten the house and reclaim the land. It should have been a simple job, but nothing about the Rowe legacy ever ended clean. On the second day of raising, a foreman noticed something strange behind the pantry wall. A section where the brickwork was slightly newer, smoother, almost too perfect. It had been painted to match the rest of the wall, but the seams were shallow, the mortar cleaner. Curious, they took hammers to it. Behind the bricks was a hollow space, no larger than a child's bedroom, but colder than the cellar they'd sealed years ago. A single oil lamp still rested in one corner, long extinguished, but the air inside carried no dust, just a stillness that pulled into the lungs like a breath not meant for the living. Curled in the corner, knees drawn to chest, was a skeleton. Female. Full-grown. Her mouth had been sewn shut with horsehair, thick black strands that remained intact through rot and time, pulled taut through the bone, slicing between the teeth. There were no signs of trauma to the skull, no broken ribs, no shackles. But her position was unnatural, not fetal, not defensive. Her arms were folded in front of her like she had posed herself, like she had waited. Her eye sockets were turned toward the wall, where words had been carved, dozens of them shallow but deliberate, etched with something small and sharp, a nail or needle. A list of names. Some were familiar: Elias, Liddy, Jonah. Others were not. Names no one had ever associated with the Rowe family, dozens of them, boys and girls. Some first names only, others with initials. A few written over others, corrections made. One entry simply read, failed. Too loud. Another, kept for later. The spacing of the names suggested they weren't scribbled in panic. They were catalogued, accounted for. This was a ledger, a roll call, and the woman in the wall had kept it. No records ever confirmed her identity. She wasn't Ruth Rowe. Dental analysis proved that. Nor did she match any missing persons from the area. But her stitching, her posture, the way she was buried inside the house rather than beneath it, these things suggested she wasn't a victim in the ordinary sense. She was a participant, maybe even a witness. Some believed she had done the stitching herself. Others believed Ruth had entombed her there to silence her permanently. But a few whispered a third theory, that she had gone in willingly to watch, to wait, to become part of the structure itself. The room was resealed. No museum would take the remains. No university wanted the responsibility. Eventually, the bones were buried under state number instead of a name. But the wall carving was documented, every name transcribed, and when the list was compared to old census data, inconsistencies began to appear. Orphans misplaced, students marked transferred, young laborers who appeared in one ledger but vanished from the next. It was clear then, the Rowe house hadn't just hidden the children we knew. It had kept others, unseen, unnamed, unclaimed. And somewhere in the crawlspace between brick and silence, a woman had watched them all disappear. The church ledgers of Dawson County were always considered a kind of backbone for the town. Births, marriages, deaths, baptisms, all set neatly in rows by the hand of whichever pastor was serving at the time. The paper was thick, the entries methodical. But when archivists studied the records from the years leading to the Rowe burials, something unsettled them. The handwriting between 1814 and 1816 was flawless. Too flawless. Every entry, no matter the name or date, bore the same careful slant, the same even pressure, the same looping curl of an S or the sharp line of a T. At first it was thought to be Pastor Allgood's hand. But side by side the differences were plain. His writing was looser, his ink strokes shaky, smudged by sweat. These entries, by contrast, looked deliberate, mechanical, perfect. And then there was the ink itself. Though faded to brown with age, its hue was darker than the rest, almost black still, as if it resisted time. Samples were taken in the 20th century when the ledgers were preserved, and chemical tests revealed something the archivists hadn't expected. The ink wasn't derived from gallnut or charcoal, as was standard. It carried proteins, organic traces where no plant compounds existed. Further study revealed the source, not plant, not mineral, human. The base of the ink had been drawn from bone marrow, treated and blended with iron filings, heated until it formed a liquid dense enough to hold on the quill. Whoever had written these records had done so with a fluid taken from the living. The implications sickened those who handled the book. These weren't just names on a page. They were names written into flesh. Whole years of baptisms, marriages, and burials transcribed in blood's cousin marrow, like the record itself had to be paid for with bodies. Some of the names even repeated, entries copied over from earlier years, rewritten as if replacing what once existed with something new. Some couples were shown married twice. Some children appeared in the book without ever appearing in census rolls. It was as if the ledger had been rewritten to invent, erase, or reshape the lives of those in Dawson County, anchoring them to something they had not chosen. Even more chilling, the samples showed subtle differences in composition from page to page, as if the marrow used came from different individuals. One batch contained higher levels of calcium, another traces of mercury, Another carried residues suggesting malnutrition. These weren't abstract fluids. They were fragments of real people reduced to ink, bound into paper. And someone, perhaps Ruth, perhaps another hand, had used them to overwrite the town's memory. The church tried to bury the findings. Too grotesque, they said, too blasphemous. But the records leaked. A report noted faint indentations in the margins near certain names. Invisible at first glance, but under raking light, they revealed a code. Lines like tally marks, grouped in fives, running parallel to specific entries, as if counting, measuring, keeping score. And on the final page of 1816, beneath the name Rowe, a symbol appeared. Not a cross, not a signature, just a circle, closed tight, filled with black that had not faded. A mark that even now refuses to lift from the paper. The ledger sits locked in climate-controlled storage. Access is restricted. But those who viewed it describe the same feeling, that the book isn't archival, it's alive. That the black letters don't just sit still on the page, they watch, waiting for someone to turn the next leaf, to finish the record where it left off. Long before the coffins of stone, before the salt room was uncovered, Ruth Rowe had opened the doors of her farmhouse under a different guise. In 1812, she announced to the county that she would be offering instruction to children she called the gifted. The word carried a hopeful weight in the community. Parents with restless or peculiar children, those who didn't fit neatly into the routines of fieldwork or church lessons, were eager for someone who promised structure. Ruth carried herself with authority, and the Rowe land, though remote, had the quiet of a place meant for study. By summer, half a dozen children had been sent to her for what she described as special education in discipline and will. But no alumni ever came from that place. No letters home spoke of achievements. No records survive of lessons taught. Instead, what exists are fragments from her journals found decades later beneath the floorboards. She wrote not of teaching but of unlearning. The word appeared again and again: physiological unlearning, erasure of appetite, unbinding of speech. The entries outlined procedures that sounded less like schoolwork and more like conditioning. She described long fasts where children were made to go without food or water for days, then sit in rows while she read prayers backward. She described sessions where silence was demanded for such long stretches that a single cough would send a child to the cellar. The journals spoke of her obsession with stillness. Movement is refusal, she wrote. Breath is the first rebellion. In one passage, she outlined her belief that children were born carrying too much, impulses, hungers, chaos, and that her role was to strip them back to a blank state where obedience could be written in. They must be made hollow, she wrote, so that their flesh may remember what their minds resist. She spoke of a point beyond pain, where the body stopped protesting. To her, that point was not cruelty. It was progress. When the house was investigated nearly 70 years later, no desks were found, no chalkboards, no lessons scrawled on slates. Instead, in the barn and cellar, they uncovered restraints bolted into beams, leather straps frayed from years of use, and a set of hollow mannequins carved crudely from wood. Each mannequin was child-sized. Each was seated, positioned as though in a classroom. But their faces were left featureless, smooth except for one grotesque omission. No mouths, just blank rounded planes where mouths should have been. In the journals, Ruth had written of them as models for the children to mirror, empty of speech, empty of hunger, perfect in form. One witness account from 1814, written by a farmhand who delivered goods to the Rowe house, recalled seeing children standing in a row outside, each with a strip of cloth tied across their mouths. They were pale, thin, their eyes fixed on the ground. He remembered thinking they were ill, but Ruth waved him off, saying they were practicing fasts of the tongue. He told no one. When asked decades later why, he admitted he believed her. It was easier than believing the alternative. The tragedy is that no list of pupils was ever kept, or if it was, it vanished with her. Census records show a handful of children in surrounding farms who disappeared from rolls during those years, explained away as deaths or relocations. Their families grieved quietly, but no graves were marked, no obituaries written, as if shame had swallowed the loss. And so the school faded from memory until only whispers remained. But the evidence in the house could not be denied. The straps, the mannequins, the journals, all painted a picture not of education but of eradication. Ruth Rowe had not been a teacher. She had been an architect of silence, using the guise of learning to mask a deeper experiment. She was not shaping children into scholars. She was stripping them into vessels. And whatever they learned, there was not knowledge, but absence. Absence of voice, absence of appetite, absence of self. By the time investigators finished their report, one phrase from her journal stood out above all the others, underlined twice in her own sharp hand. To unmake is the purest form of teaching. By 1820, the Rowe farmhouse stood alone, windows shattered by wind, shutters curled back like dead petals. The road that once led to it was no longer listed on county maps. Grass overtook the path. Trees leaned inward, cloaking the house in a permanent dusk, even at midday. Children were warned away. Farmers avoided the land by miles, detouring wagons rather than pass too near. The name Rowe stopped appearing in conversation, not whispered, not cursed, simply erased. It wasn't shame, it was survival. No official declaration was ever made, no ruling, no order to vacate. Ruth Rowe had simply vanished. Some claimed they saw her boarding a northbound carriage. Others swore she had disappeared into the forest behind the house and never returned. One man said he saw her reflection in his own mirror a week after she was last seen. Her face calm, her mouth stitched with thread. But no body was found, no grave dug, no ending offered. She was gone, and the town turned away from the house as if it had never stood. And yet that same year, Georgia quietly passed a new law. It was buried in a list of state education provisions and domestic policy reforms. Households with 5 or more children shall be subject to routine health and welfare visits by state-appointed assessors with or without notice. No explanation was given. No legislator cited a reason for the sudden oversight, but historians later noted that such a policy was unprecedented in its time. No other state had anything like it, not in 1820, not for decades to come. The law came after months of strange silence from Dawson County. An archivist reviewing early drafts of the legislation found scribbled marginalia beside the clause, to prevent unseen cruelty in private holdings. Another note read, "The Rowe precedent must not repeat." But these annotations never made it into public record. The Rowe name was never uttered during debate. Instead, the law passed unanimously, quietly, as if everyone in the room knew what it was really for, and none dared speak it aloud. Sometime later, when the church underwent its first interior renovation, workers discovered that one entire wall behind the pulpit had been papered over. Beneath it were names, written directly on the wooden boards in a heavy black pigment, each in a child's handwriting. There were dozens. Some matched the church ledgers, others did not. A few were scratched out, overwritten by numbers. Above them all, in letters jagged and uneven, were 3 words: "We were here." The pastor at the time ordered the wall resealed. He claimed the writing was a prank from years past, but the laborers who uncovered it refused to work in the building again. One claimed the ink hadn't faded with time. Another said he saw handprints appear on the boards, faint and wet, though no one else was near. What the town had tried to forget did not vanish. It simply shifted underground, into law, into superstition, into the kinds of silent customs that don't get written down. By the mid-century, no one in Dawson County named their daughters Ruth. Teachers were instructed to report excessive quiet in students. And for nearly 100 years, not one home in the county ever claimed 5 children living under one roof. The Rowe house eventually collapsed in on itself during a thunderstorm in 1893. No lightning strike, no fire, just a slow folding inward like a mouth finally closing. Nothing was salvaged. The debris was never cleared. Wild vines consumed the remnants. And what remained beneath, salted rooms, stitched ledgers, dark rituals, stayed buried beneath layers of earth and silence. The town moved forward. It built new roads, new schools, new rules. But beneath it all, something stayed taut. Attention, a remembering that did not use words. The law, still on the books but rarely mentioned, remains today in its original phrasing, unchanged. And the space where the Rowe house once stood is still empty, fenced by barbed wire, though no livestock graze nearby. The land remembers what people cannot, or will not, and it waits. In the autumn of 1998, under the cold light of forensic lamps and camera flashes, the soil of Dawson County was disturbed once again. A historical commission funded by the state had approved limited exhumation of unmarked graves in the churchyard as part of a preservation grant. No one expected to find anything unusual. Just decayed pine, waterlogged fabric, perhaps fragments of bone. But when the Rowe graves were opened, the earth gave back something far stranger. Beneath each headstone, beneath the settled grass and crumbled soil, lay 5 child-sized coffins exactly as they'd been described in a century-old report. Untouched, preserved by time and silence. The first coffin creaked open with a sound that made one investigator step back, as if something inside had exhaled. But there was no body, just a stone, heavy, smooth, wrapped in what was once linen, now stiff with age. That part was known, anticipated even. But what they hadn't known, what no report had ever mentioned, was what was carved into the stones themselves. Each one bore a number etched deeply and unevenly as if by a hand untrained but deliberate, 1 through 5. But that wasn't all. Surrounding the numbers were clusters of hash marks, tallies, grouped in 5s, scratched in circles around the number like the marks a prisoner makes on a wall to measure time. Each stone bore a different count. The first had 5 tallies, the second had 10, the third 15, then 20, then 25. The last stone's marks circled the entire surface, twisting over itself tally upon tally until the lines blurred together. 25. The total number of tallies across the 5 stones. It wasn't coincidence. It was a system. A ledger carved in weight and silence. The forensic team paused. One suggested they were tracking days, another proposed they were symbolic. 5 children, 5 levels, 5 phases. But when they ran tests on the stones, more anomalies appeared. The material wasn't ordinary creek rock. It was a form of limestone not native to Dawson County, with unusual mineral concentrations. Traces of iron, bone dust, and something that under UV light shimmered faintly green. Microscopic analysis revealed that the carvings had been sealed with some kind of resin, preserving the scratches from erosion. They hadn't faded. Not after nearly 2 centuries. Why stones? Why numbers? Why tally marks that counted up as if marking completion, not loss? Theories multiplied. Some believed it was ritual, others said it was record-keeping. But the question lingered. What exactly was being counted? Days survived, punishments endured, or something darker, something completed? One investigator, flipping through old church notes, stumbled on a torn journal page attributed to Pastor Allgood. It was stained and barely legible, but one line could still be read. Each stone bears not weight but measure, not remembrance but closure. No names were added to the coffins, no bodies reinterred. The graves were resealed. The stones, however, were removed for study. But in the months that followed, 3 members of the research team resigned. One refused to speak about it. Another checked into a psychiatric facility after claiming she heard scratching at night, soft, methodical, like tally marks drawn across plaster. The stones remain in state storage, locked behind 3 levels of clearance. Some say they still hum under certain lights. Others say that late at night, if you press your hand to them, they feel warm, not with heat, but with something else, something like memory or intention. And in the silence that followed the exhumation, one truth settled like dust over all of Dawson County. Those children had not been forgotten. They had been counted carefully, repeatedly, until whatever purpose they served was finished. And the stones, those blanks, silent gravestones, had known all along. There were no trials, no arrests, no confessions dragged into the light. Ruth Rowe disappeared without punishment, and no official ever spoke her name in connection to a crime. What remained wasn't justice. It was a quiet unease that spread through generations like a bruise never given time to heal. Her legacy wasn't marked in dates or documents, but in silence, in the gaps between names on census rolls, in the empty classroom records, in the unspoken rules passed from parent to child. Don't ask, don't stare, don't linger near the woods. Evil did not come to Dawson County in a burst of violence. It didn't wear horns, it didn't scream. It moved quietly, wrapped in modest dresses and pressed linens. It smiled through supper. It taught children to sit still, to fold their hands, to answer only when asked. And when they didn't, it didn't strike them, it erased them, gently, thoroughly. The kind of erasure that begins with silence and ends with a stone in a coffin. The tools used weren't blades or rope, but expectation, repetition, ritual. Ruth believed obedience was not behavior, it was identity, and when that identity faltered, she didn't punish. She corrected, through darkness, through fasting, through things too cruel for words and too careful to leave wounds. Her house became a place where children unlearned themselves until they were hollow enough to carry whatever purpose she believed in. And the world around her, whether from fear or apathy, let it happen. Laws were passed later, quiet ones. Requirements for wellness checks, rules about schooling, statutes about household size and oversight. But none of them said her name. None of them admitted what she did or what others failed to stop. Because to name it would be to see it, and seeing it meant asking how close it still lived. Today, the Rowe land is empty. No memorial marks the graves. The salt still burns in the dirt. The wind whistles differently when passing through where the attic once stood. But her story isn't buried. It's scattered, in the blood sewn into quilts, in the ink made of marrow, in ledgers rewritten to reshape truth. What Ruth left behind isn't horror. It's instruction. She showed how evil can thrive not through chaos, but through order. Through rules so tightly woven they suffocate. So now we ask, not as historians but as people, how does obedience survive death? When do routines become rituals? And when kindness wears cruelty's face, would we recognize it? Or would we smile, nod, and call it discipline? What do you think? Could this happen again?